December 7th, 1941. A Sunday morning sky over Oahu. Japanese carrier planes tore through the Pacific sun, their engines screaming as bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. Within 2 hours, the U.S. Pacific Fleet was crippled. Battleships burning, sailors fighting fire with bare hands, smoke rising into a black column that announced humiliation to the world. For Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, mastermind of the strike, the operation was a triumph, but also a gamble. He had warned his colleagues in Tokyo that Japan could only win for 6 months, maybe a year, before American industry swung fully into action. His confidence rested on one assumption, that the Imperial Navy's communications system, encoded in the JN-25 cipher, was unbreakable. Japanese officers believed their codes as safe as iron walls. They never imagined that even as Pearl Harbor burned, their private words were already being unraveled in a basement in Hawaii. At Pearl Harbor's station HYPO, tucked in an unremarkable building near the submarine base, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his small team of cryptanalysts sat surrounded by paper scraps, punch cards, and half-broken code groups. Their work was tedious, mind-numbing, rows of numbers, fragments of intercepted Japanese transmissions, repeated thousands of times. But Rochefort's mind was sharp, his team relentless. They had been working on JN-25 long before Pearl Harbor, chipping away at patterns, reconstructing codebooks through logic and repetition. By early 1942, while the nation reeled from disaster, Station HYPO was already reading enough of Japan's naval signals to glimpse enemy intentions. It wasn't perfect. Whole words remained missing, meanings had to be guessed. But it was enough to start building pictures, ship designations, convoy movements, officer transfers. The irony was brutal. Japanese admirals, confident in their secrecy, spoke openly over radio. They sent long, detailed orders across the Pacific, never suspecting that the Americans were listening. The war Japan fought was one of steel, fuel, and courage. The war America fought included silence, patience, and broken codes. Admiral Chester Nimitz, newly appointed commander of the Pacific Fleet, relied on this silence. His intelligence officer, Commander Edwin Layton, translated Rochefort's cryptic fragments into operational maps. Every intercept was a clue. The call sign of a cruiser, the routine resupply request of an air group, the timing of a fleet departure. Piece by piece, a mosaic of Japanese intentions took shape. The Doolittle raid of April 1942 underscored the stakes. 16 American B-25 bombers, launched from the deck of the carrier Hornet, struck Tokyo in a daring psychological blow. The material damage was small, but the humiliation enormous. Japanese leaders vowed to crush American carriers before they could strike again. Yamamoto proposed his grand operation: lure the U.S. fleet into battle near a tiny atoll called Midway, destroy their carriers in a decisive ambush, and force Washington to negotiate peace. The plan was brilliant on paper, overwhelming in scale. 4 carriers, supported by battleships, cruisers, and an invasion force. Yamamoto envisioned a vast net tightening around Midway, trapping the Americans. He assumed secrecy would be absolute. No enemy, he believed, could possibly anticipate such an elaborate strike. But the sound of silence was against him. At Station HYPO, Rochefort's team intercepted fragments that mentioned a location identified only as AF. Japanese messages repeated it over and over. Fuel stockpiles at AF, invasion fleet to AF, strike force rendezvous near AF. But where was AF? Was it Midway? Or perhaps another Pacific outpost? Nimitz needed certainty. Rochefort devised a trap. Midway's radio operators, following HYPO's instructions, sent an uncoded message reporting that their freshwater distillation plant had broken down. Days later, Japanese transmissions reported that AF was short of water. The deception worked. AF was Midway. The US now knew exactly where Yamamoto planned to strike. In Tokyo, no one questioned the leak. No suspicion crossed Yamamoto's staff that enemy cryptanalysts had penetrated JN-25. To them, it was impossible. They believed American carriers would be caught by surprise, sailing blindly into disaster. Yamamoto himself, writing orders late into the night, declared the Midway operation the decisive battle of the Pacific War. Yet every word he wrote travelled across the airwaves, captured by listening stations in Hawaii and Australia, reconstructed by codebreakers working 20-hour days. Each message, believed secret, became another brick in the wall of his own defeat. By late May 1942, Nimitz had moved his carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown into ambush position northeast of Midway. American pilots, exhausted but determined, waited on their decks. Midway's airfield braced for attack, all of it orchestrated by silence, by men in Hawaiian basements reading enemy plans like open letters. The Japanese Navy, pride of the empire, steamed eastward with 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Their decks gleamed, their pilots elite, their admirals supremely confident. They believed in secrecy, in surprise, in destiny. They never realized that their faith in JN-25 was a fatal illusion. The trap was set. The world's most powerful carrier strike force was sailing straight into an ambush carefully prepared by an enemy who already knew the day, the hour, and the target. And the men who designed the operation never knew. April 1942. The basement rooms of Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor smelled of sweat, tobacco, and machine oil. The air was thick with Hawaiian humidity, but no windows opened onto the Pacific outside. Instead, men hunched over desks, their ears pressed to headsets, pencils scratching across endless pads of intercepted Japanese code groups. Ceiling fans spun sluggishly above them, barely cutting the heat. In these cramped rooms, with walls lined by filing cabinets stuffed with fragments of intercepted radio traffic, the fate of the Pacific was being decided in silence. Commander Joseph Rochefort wore his trademark smoking jacket and slippers, attire that made him look more like a weary professor than the man leading the most important intelligence operation of the war. He and his cryptanalysts were working 18 to 20-hour days, fueled by gallons of black coffee and the monotony of listening to meaningless streams of numbers. The Japanese naval code, JN-25, was not one cipher, but a system of more than 30,000 code groups, each obscured by random additives. Breaking it was like trying to read a shredded book, then burned, then reassembled from ashes. But by the spring of 1942, Station HYPO had reassembled enough of that book to glimpse sentences. The team could read perhaps 10 to 15% of intercepted traffic, just enough to catch references to something the Japanese kept calling AF. The word appeared repeatedly: fleet movements to AF, supply requests from AF, reconnaissance near AF. Rochefort's analysts suspected it meant Midway, the tiny coral atoll 1,300 miles northwest of Oahu, but suspicion wasn't proof. Admiral Chester Nimitz, cautious by nature, refused to commit carriers to an ambush on a hunch. He needed confirmation. The question of AF consumed the room. Every analyst circled around it, chasing fragments like bloodhounds. Some argued it might be Johnston Island, or even Hawaii itself. If the interpretation was wrong, the entire Pacific Fleet could sail into disaster. Days ticked by, messages piled up, and the enemy fleet steamed closer to its objective. Then Rochefort proposed something audacious. If AF was Midway, he reasoned, then a unique signal from Midway should echo back through Japanese transmissions. The plan was simple, but dangerous. Midway's garrison would send an uncoded radio message, one the Japanese were certain to intercept, reporting that their freshwater distillation plant had broken down. Without distillation, Midway would run short of potable water in days. If Japanese intercepts then mentioned AF lacking water, the riddle would be solved. On May 19, 1942, the false message went out. From Midway's tiny radio shack, operators tapped across the Pacific ether. Midway's water distillation plant has broken. We have less than 2 weeks' supply of fresh water. It was deliberately left unencrypted, a message designed not for Americans but for Japanese ears. Then the codebreakers waited. Hours turned into a day into 2. The rooms of HYPO grew tense, every analyst straining for the proof. On May 21st, the confirmation arrived. A Japanese transmission, intercepted and partially broken, reported that AF is short on water. Rochefort passed the slip of paper to Leighton, who passed it to Nimitz. For the first time, the US command knew with certainty. AF was Midway. Nimitz had his proof. With calm deliberation, he made the most important gamble of his career. He would trust Rochefort's team completely. 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the battered Yorktown, rushed back to sea after Coral Sea, would sail to lie in wait northeast of Midway. They would not defend Hawaii or scatter across the Pacific. They would converge exactly where the Japanese thought themselves unseen. The beauty of the ruse lay in its silence. To the Japanese, nothing seemed amiss. They congratulated themselves on secrecy. Admiral Yamamoto's staff believed their radio discipline perfect, their codes unbroken. They assumed the Americans would be caught off guard, carriers lured into a trap they couldn't possibly foresee. On Japanese charts, Midway was marked as the bait that would finish what Pearl Harbor began. Inside Station HYPO, men who rarely saw sunlight passed folded slips of paper across desks. Each fragment of intercepted chatter became a building block in Nimitz's mosaic. The timing of the Japanese strike force, the diversionary attack on the Aleutians, even the deployment of submarines ahead of Midway, all of it arrived through the earphones and scribbled notes of cryptanalysts in slippers, chain-smoking while they worked. Rochefort's team knew they would never fire a bullet in this war, never launch from a carrier deck, never strap themselves into a P-38 or a Wildcat. Their battlefield was silence, their weapon deception. Yet when the message came, AF is short of water, they had delivered a strike as devastating as any torpedo. They had given Nimitz certainty. From that moment, every American preparation for Midway was made in full knowledge of the enemy's plan. Marine engineers reinforced runways, anti-aircraft gunners emplaced batteries, submarines prowled expected approach routes. Carrier decks groaned with aircraft and fuel reserves. Pilots were briefed not on guesses, but on the exact hour and direction from which the Japanese would come. Meanwhile, the Japanese sailed east, confident, unworried, believing in their invisibility. Yamamoto still wrote orders with the assurance of surprise. His carrier commanders, Nagumo foremost among them, assumed American carriers would appear only after Midway had been pounded into rubble. Not one officer suspected that their enemies already knew the trap in detail. The AF water shortage was a small deception, a single message flicked into the ether. But its consequences were vast. It confirmed the enemy's target, allowed Nimitz to mass his forces, and turned Yamamoto's grand design into an ambush. The Japanese never learned that their confidence in JN-25 was misplaced. To them, their defeat at Midway would appear as misfortune, perhaps luck. They never realized it had been engineered in a sweaty basement by men in slippers listening to silence. The war had turned, and it had turned on a lie about a broken water distillation plant. In Tokyo, in the high-ceilinged rooms of the Naval General Staff, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto spoke with the certainty of a man who believed his plan could change the fate of nations. He had been the reluctant architect of Pearl Harbor, the admiral who had famously warned that Japan could run wild for 6 months, but had no guarantee beyond that. By the spring of 1942, those 6 months were nearly up. The Doolittle raid had struck Tokyo in April, humiliating the empire before its own citizens. Yamamoto knew America's aircraft carriers remained the decisive threat in the Pacific. To destroy them now, he believed, would buy Japan time to consolidate its empire, fortify its defences, and force the United States to negotiate. The weapon he proposed was not a single blow, but a masterpiece of naval choreography, Operation MI, the seizure of Midway Atoll. His vision was bold, almost theatrical. The Japanese carrier strike force, led by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, would sail east to smash Midway's airfield and defences. Behind them would come an invasion fleet, heavy with transports, cruisers, and battleships to occupy the island. Farther to the west, Yamamoto himself would command the main body, a vast armada of battleships and support vessels, ready to engage any surviving American fleet in a decisive surface battle. At the same time, a diversionary force would attack the Aleutian Islands to draw American attention north. It was a grand plan, too grand, some officers thought. Yamamoto believed in overwhelming scale, in creating so many simultaneous movements that his enemy could not possibly counter them all. He envisioned the US Navy rushing to defend Midway, only to find itself trapped between Nagumo's carriers and Yamamoto's battleships. It was Pearl Harbor reversed. The Americans would steam blindly into destruction. The foundation of Yamamoto's confidence rested on secrecy. The Japanese Navy trusted its codes absolutely. Communications were encrypted using the JN-25 system, which officers believed impenetrable. Orders flowed freely across thousands of miles of ocean. Messages included details of fleet composition, fuel requirements, rendezvous times, even the precise schedule of Yamamoto's personal movements. Every word was transmitted under the assumption that no enemy could possibly decipher them in time. In reality, Yamamoto was whispering his intentions into the enemy's ear. Thousands of miles away in Hawaii, Rochefort's team at Station HYPO was quietly piecing together Operation MI weeks before the first Japanese ship sailed. By May 1942, they had intercepted message after message referencing AF, the code name they had just confirmed as Midway. They read about fuel depots, submarine screens, diversionary operations in the Aleutians. They traced Nagumo's carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu preparing for departure. The very skeleton of Yamamoto's plan was already pinned to maps on Nimitz's wall in Pearl Harbor. The irony was staggering. As Yamamoto's staff polished their war games in Tokyo, American officers in Hawaii were effectively playing the same games with the enemy's pieces already revealed. Japanese planning conferences took place with all the gravity of empire. In the Navy Ministry, models of the Pacific dotted long tables, and senior officers leaned over them in smoke-filled rooms. Staff officers debated timing, logistics, and the placement of submarine picket lines. Yamamoto pushed for boldness, the Aleutian feint to the north, the simultaneous strike on Midway, the crushing surface engagement to follow. His subordinates, some cautious, dared to question the complexity. But Yamamoto's prestige was immense. He had delivered Pearl Harbor. His vision carried the day. Surprise is the essence of war, Yamamoto told them. We must strike where they do not expect. But surprise had already evaporated. Rochefort's men, in their cramped basement, were working through the night, reconstructing messages from fragments, filling chalkboards with call signs and sortie orders. They could not read every word, but they didn't need to. The pattern was unmistakable. On May 27th, they broke a message indicating Nagumo's carriers would launch their Midway strike on June 4th. The Americans now knew not just the target, but the day. Nimitz listened as Leighton laid out the details, message by message. Japanese submarines would form a line northeast of Midway on June 3rd. The carrier strike force would attack Midway on June 4th. The invasion transports would arrive on June 6th. Every date, every movement was already visible, like an opponent's chessboard seen from above. Back in Tokyo, the war games played out with optimism. Officers role-played the Americans, but their scripted moves assumed ignorance and hesitation. When one officer suggested that the Americans might somehow arrive early, the scenario was dismissed as unrealistic. The assumption was absolute. American cryptanalysis did not exist. This blind faith in security persisted throughout the war. During post-war interrogations in 1945 and 1946, Japanese officers were asked whether they suspected their codes had been compromised at Midway. Almost unanimously, they denied it. Vice Admiral Akagi, Yamamoto's chief of staff, insisted that no one in the combined fleet considered it a possibility. Captain Tamechi Hara later wrote in his memoirs that the idea never crossed their minds. We believed our codes were secure. To think otherwise was unthinkable. The dramatic irony is cruel. While Japanese officers pored over charts, convinced of their invisibility, every line they drew was duplicated in real time by Rochefort's analysts thousands of miles away. They thought they were hiding a dagger behind their back. In truth, the Americans had already seen the blade. Still, Yamamoto's confidence carried him. He believed the Midway operation would complete what Pearl Harbor had begun: the destruction of America's carriers, the crippling of its Pacific fleet, the psychological blow that would force Roosevelt to the bargaining table. On May 29th, Yamamoto boarded the battleship Yamato, his floating headquarters, to direct the main body. He was serene, even cheerful, telling aides that the battle ahead would decide the course of the war. To his staff, the plan seemed flawless. 4 carriers to smash Midway, battleships to crush any survivors, submarines to pick off reinforcements, a feint to scatter American defenses. How could the enemy know? How could they resist? They did not realize that their opponents already knew where they would be, when they would be there, and in what strength. Every date, every movement, every arrow on Yamamoto's carefully drawn charts already existed in duplicate in Nimitz's headquarters. The Americans were not guessing. They were waiting. The trap Yamamoto built for his enemies had become his own. The Pacific dawn came slowly on June 4, 1942. Over Midway Atoll, the horizon glowed faintly pink, then deepened to orange. Seabirds wheeled above the lagoon, unaware that history's most decisive carrier battle was minutes away. On the decks of 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, pilots tightened flight goggles, mechanics checked fuel lines, and crews strained under the weight of 250-kilogram bombs. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, had followed his orders with precision. At 0430, the decks roared alive as strike aircraft rolled forward. 108 planes thundered into the morning sky, bound for Midway's airfield. Below, flight deck crews prepared reserve aircraft, armed alternately for anti-ship or ground attack, depending on what reconnaissance might reveal. For Nagumo, the day had begun according to plan. Surprise, he believed, was intact. Yet beyond the horizon, lying silent against the sea, 3 American carriers already waited: Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown. Admiral Chester Nimitz's gamble had paid off. Rochefort's cryptanalysts had told him the exact day and hour of the Japanese strike. The American task forces, under Admirals Frank Jack Fletcher and Raymond Spruance, had taken position northeast of Midway, hidden in empty ocean. Nagumo thought he was the hunter. He was already the prey. At 0600, the first wave of Japanese aircraft struck Midway. Bombs blasted craters in runways, fuel tanks erupted in sheets of fire, marine defenders scrambled to their guns. Yet the atoll did not fall silent. Anti-aircraft bursts filled the sky, and marine fighters clawed desperately at the incoming swarm. When the Japanese strike leaders reported back, their message was clear. Midway was damaged but not neutralized. A second strike would be required. Nagumo now faced a fatal dilemma. He had kept half his aircraft in reserve, originally armed with anti-ship ordnance in case American carriers appeared. At dawn, with no enemy fleet sighted, he had ordered them rearmed for a second strike against Midway. Now, at 0715, a scout plane belatedly reported sighting 10 enemy ships to the northeast. The report was incomplete, lacking details, but it was enough to sow chaos. Should Nagumo recall his strike planes and rearm his reserves for anti-ship duty, or press ahead with a second strike on Midway? He chose to wait, an hour of hesitation that doomed him. While Japanese decks filled with live ordnance, bombs being swapped for torpedoes in a dangerous ballet of men and munitions, American aircraft were already en route. From Midway itself, Marine torpedo planes and B-26s made suicidal runs against the Japanese carriers, losing nearly every aircraft but forcing Nagumo's combat air patrol to burn fuel and ammunition. The main American punch, however, came from the carriers waiting unseen to the northeast. At 0920, Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet began its attack. 15 TBD Devastators, under Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, skimmed the waves toward the Japanese fleet. They flew without fighter escort, outdated aircraft against superior Zero fighters. One by one, the Devastators were ripped from the sky. Of the 15 planes, all but one were destroyed. Ensign George Gay, floating alone in the sea, watched the battle unfold. Their sacrifice was catastrophic in one sense, but decisive in another. The Japanese combat air patrol, drawn down to sea level, chasing the Devastators, left the skies above unguarded. At the same moment, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived overhead, having followed a desperate course correction at the last possible moment. Led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey and Lieutenant Dick Best, 37 Dauntless bombers broke through scattered clouds and sighted Nagumo's carriers below. At 10:20, the Pacific erupted in fire. From near vertical dives, American SBD Dauntlesses released their bombs. On Kaga, 3 direct hits ignited fuel lines and detonated armed aircraft across the hangar deck. The carrier became a floating inferno. On Akagi, a single bomb pierced the flight deck, exploding amid torpedoes and fuel tanks. Flames engulfed the flagship. Soryu took 3 hits, her hangar deck exploding in a chain reaction. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were mortally wounded, burning wrecks surrounded by lifeboats and desperate sailors. Only Hiryu survived the first strike, launching counterattacks that damaged Yorktown so heavily she would later sink. But the tide of battle was irreversible. That afternoon, Dauntlesses found Hiryu as well. 4 bombs turned her into the 4th carrier lost. By sunset, the core of Japan's striking power, carriers that had spearheaded Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier, was gone. The scale of the disaster was unprecedented. 4 fleet carriers, more than 250 aircraft, and hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots were destroyed in a single day. Japanese officers watched in disbelief as their proud decks became funeral pyres. Survivors wept as they abandoned ships, knowing the heart of the Kido Butai, the elite First Air Fleet, was annihilated. On the American side, elation was tempered by grief. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 and others had been near total. Pilots who had flown knowing they could not return had nonetheless pinned the Japanese air cover at sea level, opening the skies for the decisive dive-bombing strike. Their courage, married to code-breaking and timing, had tipped the balance of the Pacific War. For the Japanese, the shock was compounded by confusion. Officers aboard surviving escorts asked the same question again and again. How had the Americans been waiting? Nagumo's staff scoured possibilities. Perhaps their movements had been spotted by submarines, or perhaps reconnaissance from Midway had detected them. None considered the true cause. The idea that their codes were broken remained unthinkable. In Tokyo, reports filtered back with disbelief. 4 carriers gone, thousands of sailors dead, the best aircrews destroyed. Midway, meant to be the decisive victory, had become a decisive defeat. The Naval General Staff attributed the disaster to luck, to reconnaissance failures, to the fog of war. Never once did they suspect that every date, every movement, every word of their plan had been read in advance in a basement in Pearl Harbor. As darkness fell on June 4th, the seas burned with oil and wreckage. Sailors clung to debris, aircraft bobbed like broken toys, and the Pacific, indifferent, rolled over the corpses of two great fleets. For America, the victory at Midway meant survival and the first step toward offensive war. For Japan, it was the beginning of a decline from which it would never recover. The ambush had been perfect, almost surgical, and the men who had walked into it never understood that the silence they trusted, their sacred codes, had betrayed them from the start. The flames of Midway had barely dimmed when the struggle to explain the disaster began. On June 7, 1942, the battered remnants of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's combined fleet limped westward, their surviving carriers screened by destroyers and cruisers whose decks still smelled of fuel and scorched paint. Thousands of sailors had gone down with their ships. Hundreds of Japan's best pilots, the elite of the carrier striking arm, were gone forever. Yet in Tokyo, the Imperial Naval General Staff clung to silence. 4 carriers lost in a single battle could not be admitted without shattering public confidence. At first, the news was disguised. Japanese communiqué admitted that some damage had been suffered near Midway, while claiming heavy blows against the US Pacific Fleet. Radio Tokyo reported that enemy carriers had been sunk, a fiction designed to maintain morale. The truth, that Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the very carriers of Pearl Harbor, had been annihilated, was withheld even from many within the Imperial Navy. When Emperor Hirohito was briefed, the phrasing was cautious. "Our fleet has suffered regrettable damage." In American newspapers, by contrast, headlines screamed triumph. The US Navy released details of the ambush within days, calling it the most important naval battle in history. Chester Nimitz carefully credited brave aviators while keeping silent about the real secret, the work of Joseph Rochefort's team at Station HYPO. In Pearl Harbor, Rochefort and his cryptanalysts remained in their cramped basement, unacknowledged, while their decrypts reshaped the war. Within the Japanese fleet, disbelief reigned. Surviving officers struggled to understand how the Americans had been waiting in precisely the right place. Reconnaissance had been delayed by mechanical failures. Submarine patrol lines had been set too far east. Some argued that an unlucky sighting must have revealed their position. Others suggested divine misfortune. But not one officer suspected the real cause, the compromise of the JN-25 Naval Code. The irony was cruel. Throughout the spring of 1942, Imperial Navy planners had congratulated themselves on their secrecy. Yamamoto's Midway plan depended on operational surprise, and Tokyo's code officers insisted JN-25 remained unbreakable. In fact, as Rochefort's notebooks already showed, more than 85% of critical code groups had been solved by late May. Every movement, date, and order was being read across desks in Hawaii before Japanese commanders even set sail. Post-war interrogations confirmed this blindness. In 1946, former staff officer Ryunosuke Kusaka admitted, "At the time of Midway, we never imagined our codes were broken. We believed completely in their security. We thought the Americans had simply guessed correctly." Another officer described American foreknowledge as a coincidence of fate, unable to admit that Japanese naval communications had been compromised for months. This denial was more than technical. It was cultural. The Imperial Navy's officer corps had been raised in a tradition of secrecy, loyalty, and disdain for enemy intelligence. The concept that Americans, regarded as undisciplined and materialistic, could master cryptanalysis of complex naval codes was considered absurd. Even after repeated defeats later in the war, many Japanese staff officers insisted that JN-25 had never truly been broken. That blind spot allowed the US to maintain its advantage. Even as Midway became public knowledge, HYPO's success was hidden not only from the Japanese, but also from many within the American military. Nimitz and Washington leadership feared that any leak of the truth would alert Tokyo to change its codes. The victory was credited to American bravery and good scouting, while Rochefort's team slipped back into obscurity. Midway's outcome transformed the Pacific War. Until June 1942, Japan had held the initiative, striking across the ocean in an expanding perimeter of conquest. With the loss of 4 carriers, that initiative was gone. Yamamoto had intended Midway to lure the US Pacific Fleet into destruction. Instead, the reverse had occurred. The heart of Japan's striking power had been destroyed in a single morning. Carrier warfare was unforgiving. Airframes could be replaced, but trained aviators could not. The loss of hundreds of veteran pilots at Midway left Japan's carrier decks manned by increasingly inexperienced replacements. By contrast, American training programs were just beginning to accelerate. Production lines at Grumman, Douglas, and Lockheed were building aircraft faster than Japan could destroy them. Midway marked the turning point. Japan would never again mount a strategic offensive in the Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of the Midway Plan, was devastated. In his flagship Yamato, he received news of the carrier losses with visible anguish. Yet his public stance was measured. To subordinates he said only, "The gods have deserted us." Privately, he admitted that the gamble had failed, but he never accepted that his codes had been the true culprit. Yamamoto, who had studied in America and once warned that Japan could not win a long war, understood more than most the danger of underestimating American industry. But even he could not imagine that American cryptanalysts had been reading his every move. In post-war testimony, surviving staff members recalled Yamamoto's enduring faith in Japanese security. "We thought our communications were safe," one said at the 1962 US-Japan Aviation History Symposium. "Had we known they were broken, our entire operational concept would have been different. But we never suspected." For Nimitz and his commanders, the secret of code-breaking remained sacrosanct. At victory celebrations in Hawaii, returning pilots were hailed as heroes, but Rochefort's basement team received no recognition. Only decades later would their contribution be fully acknowledged. The decision to protect the secret was deliberate. The longer the Japanese trusted their compromised codes, the more victories could be shaped from hidden knowledge. Even at the height of the Midway triumph, Nimitz reminded his staff, "This victory is not final. It is the beginning." He knew the Pacific War would stretch for years, but he also knew that HYPO's silence had turned the tide. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff issued new directives, but JN-25 remained largely unchanged until months later. Japanese officers continued to transmit in the same compromised system, convinced their defeat had come from tactical errors rather than broken secrecy. The blind spot held. The irony remained. Midway was lost not because Yamamoto's plan was flawed, nor because Japanese sailors lacked courage, but because their faith in code security was absolute. Every step of the plan they considered secret was written, translated, and placed on Nimitz's desk days in advance. When historians gathered veterans in Hawaii in 1985 for the Pacific Theater reunion, the Midway question was asked again. American pilots spoke of the cryptanalytic miracle that placed them in position. Japanese survivors shook their heads. One elderly officer remarked, "We never believed it. Even after the war, I could not accept it. To think our sacred codes betrayed us, it was too much. The record tells otherwise." From the AF Needs Water trick in May to the precise ambush in June, American codebreakers had stripped away the veil of Japanese secrecy. The men who walked into the trap never knew it, even as their carriers exploded beneath them. In that denial lies the final irony of Midway. The greatest naval defeat in Japanese history was not only a failure of arms, but a failure of imagination, the inability to believe that the enemy had already read the script. 10 months after the flames of Midway, the war in the Pacific had shifted irreversibly. Guadalcanal had drained Japan's strength. American carriers, once scarce and fragile, now prowled the seas in growing numbers. And behind the lines, in dimly lit rooms in Hawaii and Australia, the same silent figures who had broken JN-25 kept plying their trade. They were anonymous, their faces unknown to the aviators they saved. But their typewriters and cipher sheets had become as decisive as any bomb. For Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the sting of Midway never faded. In March 1943, he approved a bold plan to tour forward bases in the Solomon Islands to boost morale. Japanese officers remembered him as charismatic, able to inspire men even in defeat. His presence was meant to show confidence, yet this very gesture of reassurance would expose him to America's invisible reach. On April 13, 1943, at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, operators intercepted a long Japanese message in JN-25. It carried the routine heading of Combined Fleet Traffic, but its contents were astonishing. Yamamoto's detailed inspection schedule for April 18th. Every waypoint, every takeoff, every arrival was listed in precise hours. The message included his departure from Rabaul at 6 a.m., his arrival at Balala airstrip by 8 a.m., the aircraft types in his escort, and even the tail numbers of the Mitsubishi G4M, Betty bombers carrying him and his staff. The decrypt was rushed to Admiral Chester Nimitz, then to Admiral William Bull Halsey in the South Pacific. Halsey immediately saw opportunity. The commander who had struck Pearl Harbor, who had gambled and lost at Midway, was now within reach. President Roosevelt approved the operation personally. The code name, Operation Vengeance. The responsibility fell to the 339th Fighter Squadron of the 347th Fighter Group, based on Guadalcanal. Their aircraft, the twin-engine Lockheed P-38 Lightning, was the only American fighter with the range to intercept Yamamoto's flight, over 400 miles one way across open ocean. The plan was brutally simple. 18 P-38s would depart Henderson Field before dawn, fly a precise wave-skimming course plotted by Navy navigators, and arrive over Bougainville at the exact minute Yamamoto's bombers appeared. The pilots were briefed with the utmost secrecy. Captain Thomas G. Lanphier Jr. and First Lieutenant Rex T. Barber were designated as the primary shooters. The mission was explained as targeting a senior Japanese officer. Only later would they realize the magnitude. April 18, 1943. At 7 o'clock, 18 P-38s roared down Henderson's coral runway. Each carried drop tanks to stretch their range beyond normal limits. They flew at less than 50 feet above the waves to avoid Japanese radar, maintaining radio silence, navigating by stopwatches and dead reckoning. Inside the cockpits, tension mounted. The slightest miscalculation would leave them lost over empty ocean. But the course plotted from the decoded message was flawless. As the Lightning formation neared Bougainville at 9:34, spotters saw 2 Betty bombers, each escorted by 6 Zero fighters, precisely where Station HYPO had said they would be. The trap was sprung. The Americans climbed sharply, shedding their drop tanks. The escorting Zeros turned to intercept. In the confusion, Barber and Lanphier closed on Yamamoto's bomber. Witnesses described the Betty banking sharply, trying to evade. Barber fired long bursts from his 4.50 caliber machine guns and 20mm cannon. Flames erupted along the wing. The bomber rolled, clipped the tops of the jungle trees, and exploded in a fireball. Yamamoto, the man who had once promised to dictate peace terms in the White House, was dead before he hit the ground. The second Betty, carrying Admiral Matome Ugaki, was also hit and crash-landed in the jungle. Ugaki survived, later testifying to Yamamoto's calm composure moments before the attack. He sat erect, as if unperturbed. Japanese search parties found his body hours later, still in his seat, sword at his side. News of Yamamoto's death reached Tokyo on April 19th. The Navy announced it as a glorious battlefield death, not an assassination from the air. His ashes were returned in a state funeral attended by the emperor. Yet among the staff officers, the question simmered. How had the Americans known? Officially, the explanation became that Yamamoto had been unfortunate, intercepted by routine patrols. Even Ugaki, who lived to write a memoir, insisted it was bad luck. At no point did the Imperial Navy seriously consider that their code had betrayed them. The blind spot that had doomed Midway persisted. In Washington, the danger of exposure was clear. Operation Vengeance had been made possible only because JN-25 remained penetrated. If Tokyo realized this, they would change the system immediately. Thus, American press releases framed the intercept as a lucky chance. Pilots were ordered to speak only of routine patrol. Rochefort's successors at HYPO and the Pacific code-breaking units watched nervously, but the Japanese never suspected. JN-25 remained compromised until much later in the war. Militarily, the death of Yamamoto did not cripple the Japanese fleet. By 1943, the balance of power was already shifting decisively. But symbolically, it was immense. Yamamoto had been more than a commander. He was a national figure, the mastermind of Pearl Harbor, a voice that had carried weight even when he opposed war with the United States. His death demoralized officers and sailors who believed he was irreplaceable. American morale soared. Newspapers blared headlines, "Yamamoto dead." Pilots who had endured the brutal Solomon Islands campaign felt vindicated. The man who had once terrified America with his vision of 6 months of victories was gone, his end scripted not by chance, but by intelligence. Decades later, at the 1962 U.S.-Japanese Aviation History Symposium, Japanese participants admitted they had never believed their codes broken, even after Yamamoto's death. One officer said, "We thought it coincidence. We never suspected the enemy had read our message." The irony was complete. Yamamoto had died because of the same blind faith in code security that had led him to disaster at Midway. For American codebreakers, Operation Vengeance was vindication. In the files of the Air Force Historical Research Agency, one debriefing note is blunt. Without HYPO, Yamamoto would have lived. Rochefort, still largely unrecognized, later said quietly, "We killed him with pencils, not planes." The jungle crash site on Bougainville became a shrine for Japanese sailors. Even today, rusting fragments of the Betty bomber remain. For Americans, the mission became legend, the longest fighter intercept of the war, a triumph of planning and precision. But its deeper meaning lay in continuity. Midway had proved that intelligence could change battles. Vengeance proved it could change history by eliminating a single commander. Yamamoto had once warned his superiors that in a protracted war with the United States, Japan would be grinding down steel against steel, blood against blood. He foresaw Japan's ultimate defeat. Yet he never foresaw that his own words, transmitted in what he thought was secret code, would guide American fighters to his side and end his life. The lesson was stark. In the age of radio warfare, secrecy could be an illusion. The Americans had listened, deciphered, and struck. And the admiral who had begun the Pacific War at Pearl Harbor ended it personally in a jungle clearing, betrayed not by cowardice or chance, but by the very system he trusted most. The crash of Yamamoto's bomber in Bougainville's jungle should have triggered alarms in Tokyo. His itinerary had been transmitted in full, down to the minute, through the JN-25 system. American fighters had intercepted him at the exact spot and time. To any neutral observer, the evidence was damning. The codes were compromised. Yet in the offices of the Imperial Naval General Staff, denial prevailed. The staff's intelligence branch reviewed the incident and concluded it was coincidence. Perhaps an American reconnaissance plane had shadowed Yamamoto's bomber. Perhaps traitors had leaked information. The possibility that cryptanalysis was involved was dismissed as inconceivable. JN-25 cannot be solved by foreigners. one senior officer declared. This conviction was not merely arrogance. Japanese cryptographic officers had been taught that the structure of their ciphers was mathematically secure. They believed changes in additives and super-encipherment layers made solution impossible. The cultural prejudice against American ingenuity only deepened the blindness. For Rochefort's successors at Station HYPO and the growing code-breaking units in Australia, this denial was a gift. Each week, Japanese traffic revealed movements of convoys, schedules of fleet units, and even aircraft assignments. The decrypts guided submarine wolf packs to fat targets and allowed American carriers to avoid ambush. During the campaigns in the Solomon Islands, intercepted traffic disclosed resupply runs that came to be known as the Tokyo Express. American destroyers lay in wait, guided not by luck but by decrypted orders. Later, during the Central Pacific Drive in 1944, JN-25 messages revealed the exact reinforcement timetables for Saipan and Guam. Again and again, American commanders struck with uncanny precision, while Japanese officers muttered about bad fortune. Why did Japan refuse to face the truth? Post-war interrogations shed light. Officers admitted that acknowledging a code break would have meant conceding systemic weakness. It would have required retraining thousands of signal operators and redesigning the entire cryptographic system, tasks the overstretched wartime bureaucracy resisted. More importantly, it would have damaged morale. Secrecy was treated almost as a sacred principle, and to admit its breach would have undermined faith in the Navy's aura of invincibility. Admiral Akagi, Yamamoto's surviving chief of staff, later wrote in his diary, "The death of the Admiral was tragic, but we regarded it as fate. None of us considered that our communications had betrayed us. The words are revealing. Fate was easier to accept than enemy intellect." American commanders understood the fragility of their advantage. Nimitz and his staff maintained the strictest secrecy. When journalists asked how Yamamoto had been found, Navy spokesmen credited patrols. When submarines intercepted convoys, press releases emphasized radar or scouting. Pilots were warned never to speak of intelligence leads. The success of this deception was total. Even as late as 1944, Japanese officers still believed JN-25 was intact. They blamed their defeats on American material superiority, never on information leakage. The blind spot allowed Allied cryptographers to keep harvesting secrets until the war's end. The cost of this faith was measured in ships and lives. At Midway, 4 carriers had been lost because the Americans guessed. At Bougainville, Yamamoto died because of bad luck. In the Solomons, supply convoys vanished into the sea because of enemy radar. And in the Marianas, troop reinforcements were shredded because of overwhelming US air power. Each explanation contained a sliver of truth, but ignored the common root. Broken codes. By contrast, the Allies embraced intelligence as a weapon. Reports from HYPO, from the Australian Frumell Station, and from the British Far East codebreakers were fused into operational orders. Intelligence was treated not as secondary, but as central to strategy. The results reshaped the Pacific battlefield. When the war ended and Japanese officers were interrogated, their surprise at Allied revelations was genuine. In one 1945 session, an astonished staff officer exclaimed, "You mean to say you knew our movements before we sailed?" The American interviewer replied simply, "We read your mail." The Japanese officer lowered his head in silence. At the 1985 Pacific Theater Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, the subject arose again. American veterans spoke openly of HYPO's triumphs. Japanese attendees, now elderly, admitted they had never believed such things possible. "We thought Americans lacked the patience for such work," one confessed. "We underestimated you completely." The persistence of Japanese denial ensured that the pattern set at Midway and confirmed at Bougainville repeated through the war. Each defeat was rationalized, each disaster explained away as chance or material inferiority. Yet the real truth lay in the radio rooms of Pearl Harbor and Melbourne, where young Americans in headphones pulled meaning from streams of numbers and kana. The irony endures. Japan's navy, so proud of its warrior tradition and secrecy, was undone not only by American carriers and submarines, but by the pencils, typewriters, and patient minds of codebreakers. The enemy had already read the script, and Japan never realized until it was too late. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had entered a new phase. Guadalcanal and the Solomons were behind, the Gilberts and Marshalls had fallen, and now Admiral Chester Nimitz aimed for the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Their capture would put the new Boeing B-29 superfortress within range of Tokyo itself. For Japan, the stakes were existential. The combined fleet, battered since Midway, would be forced into a decisive showdown. On June 15, 1944, U.S. Marines stormed ashore on Saipan. Within hours, Japanese High Command resolved to strike back with the full weight of their carrier force. The operation was code-named a Go. Admiral Soryu Toyoda, newly appointed Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet, declared that the decisive battle had finally arrived. Japanese staff believed their chance had come to reverse the tide. But in Pearl Harbor, the men of Station HYPO were already at work. Intercepts of JN-25 throughout May and June revealed the outlines of Operation A-Go. Dates, rally points, and even carrier dispositions were decrypted and passed to Nimitz. Once again, American forces knew the Japanese plan almost before the Japanese did. Captain Joseph Rochefort was no longer in charge, having been reassigned after Midway, but his successors carried on the tradition. By the time the Japanese fleet moved west from Tawi-Tawi in the Philippines, U.S. submarines, vectored by intelligence, were waiting. On June 19th, USS Albacore and USS Kavala struck two deadly blows, sinking carriers Taiho and Shokaku before the battle had even begun. The Japanese still outnumbered the Americans in carriers, but the quality had changed. The veteran aviators who had once dominated the skies were gone, replaced by undertrained recruits. Fuel shortages hampered training, and new aircraft were rushed into service without refinement. When the Japanese launched their first great wave of 373 aircraft on June 19th, American radar detected them hundreds of miles out. Fighter direction officers calmly vectored squadrons of F6F Hellcats into position. The result was slaughter. Pilots later recalled that the sky seemed filled with targets. By nightfall, more than 250 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed, at a loss of barely 30 American planes. The pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The scale of the disaster was no accident. Intelligence had positioned the U.S. fleet precisely where it needed to be. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding 5th Fleet, made the controversial decision to hold his carriers close to Saipan rather than chase the Japanese westward. Critics argued he was too cautious, but Spruance's staff, armed with decrypts, knew the enemy's intentions and judged that time was on America's side. The intelligence advantage extended beyond the battle. Even as Japanese aviators perished, American submarines guided by decrypts intercepted retreating carriers. By June 20th, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's carrier force was shattered. Japan's carrier aviation, already weakened at Midway and Guadalcanal, was effectively destroyed. In Tokyo, the outcome was catastrophic. Operation A-Go, hailed as the decisive battle, ended in ruin. But once again, the cause was misinterpreted. Japanese officers attributed defeat to poor training, inadequate numbers, and the reckless courage of inexperienced pilots. They spoke of radar giving the Americans an edge. Some acknowledged material inferiority, yet almost none accepted that code-breaking had given away their movements. The blind spot persisted. Even with evidence mounting from Midway to Yamamoto to the Marianas, Japanese naval staff refused to concede that their sacred codes had been broken. Post-war interrogations revealed the same refrain. We believed JN-25 secure. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was more than a tactical defeat. It was the death knell of Japan's carrier air arm. Though carriers themselves survived, their air groups were annihilated. From this point forward, Japanese carriers were little more than empty decks. At Leyte Gulf later that year, they would be used as decoys, stripped of planes. For the United States, the battle cleared the skies. Saipan fell within weeks, followed by Tinian and Guam. By November 1944, B-29 bombers were departing from the Marianas on raids against the Japanese home islands. The decisive battle Japan had sought delivered the opposite result: strategic encirclement and the beginning of direct strikes on Tokyo. At the 1962 U.S.-Japanese Aviation History Symposium, American codebreakers revealed their role in AGO. Japanese veterans expressed disbelief. One former officer remarked, "We thought the enemy had more radar, more planes." We did not think they had our words. The comment captured the enduring irony. The Japanese had prepared for a battle of steel and fire, but they had been undone by intelligence again. From Midway in 1942 to the Marianas in 1944, the story repeated itself. Japanese reliance on secrecy met American code-breaking, and disaster followed. Each time, officers explained away the defeat with chance, radar, or material weakness. Each time, the true cause remained invisible to them. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was not only the destruction of Japan's naval air arm, but also the final proof of a pattern that had defined the Pacific War. The men of Station HYPO, still labouring in cramped rooms with stacks of intercepts, knew the truth. Their pencils and typewriters had cleared the skies over Saipan as surely as the guns of the Hellcats. The Japanese never saw them, never suspected them, and never understood how thoroughly their codes had betrayed them.